we're going to be looking at pruning some evergreens, and hopefully you've caught an earlier video we did on pruning deciduous shrubs. But now we're looking at the first week of June. It's the time to start looking at pruning your evergreen shrubs. And you have to wait till the new growth comes out on the shrubs, and we'll go through a bit of that together. But now is the time to be looking at pruning your shrubs on the first week of June, second week of June. And as you can see from different plants that we have around us and that, and you'll know from evergreens, some are low spreading, some are globe shaped, some are more pyramidal form. And that becomes important when you're pruning. I always have customers say, well, I know it's going to get big, but I'll just keep it pruned round or something. And there's some facts that you need to know about how evergreens grow that will help you to understand how to prune them better in that as well. So what makes all the plants different shapes is the fact that they all have something called apical dominance. And apical dominance is talking about the fact that plants all grow from the tips. Sometimes we think that plants will grow from the bottom up, or that the trunk just keeps pushing up and more growth keeps coming out. But all plants grow from the tips of their branches. And that's very important when we're talking about evergreens. At the tips of each branch, whether it's the top one, whether it's looking down further on other ones, is where the strongest apical dominance is. And what apical dominance is plant produces a hormone called auxin. And that auxin actually suppresses growth. So if you looked at something like this pine tree here, you notice that there's new growth at the top, but then there's really no branches here in the center. So this hormone is strongest at the tips of the branch, and as the buds move further and further away from that tip, then the hormone isn't as strong, and so there's more growth happening. So the buds that's closest to the tips is usually suppressed, but as you go down, you'll see you're getting more branching coming out, and that's because there's less hormone being in the stems, and so more growth is able to go. And that becomes very important when we talk about how we're going to prune the plants in a few minutes, is that you need to understand that all plants grow from the tips, but also in taking that tip away is going to really alter the shape of that plant. So that's one of the things that we need to understand about evergreens. The other thing we need to understand about evergreens is the fact that because they keep their foliage year-round, they always compensate by losing their oldest year's foliage. And so some plants will hold on to their foliage 3, maybe up to 5 years. But if you looked in the center of any evergreen, especially in late summer, fall, you'll notice that there's a lot of browning along the main stem and lower down in the plant. So whether it's rounded, you'll still see a lot of browning in the center. And the gardeners usually get quite concerned about their plants browning in the center. But that is a natural process that the evergreens go through, is that to compensate for all that new growth they're getting out on the tips, they have to compensate by losing their oldest growth every year. And so if you see that happening late summer, don't be too concerned. It's only if there's browning going out to the tips that you need to be concerned. But if it's inner browning, that's just the way the plant has to compensate for all the new growth they gain during the season. So that also becomes very important as we prune. The best time we're talking about for pruning is always after the new growth is out. And you'll see like on the boxwoods and that, or on the yews, or maybe a dwarf or bird spruce that you have, you can tell when the new growth is pushed out because it's usually lighter green in color. Or if it's a variegated plant like euonymus, that tip growth is going to be a lot brighter. So you kind of wait till that growth is out and that lightness is starting to darken up. So all the new light green growth that we have on the boxwood, as it starts to become darker in color, that's that's a good time to be pruning the shrub at that point. And so right now, most of the evergreens are pushing out. Usually evergreens will flush out twice a year. So you'll get growth the end of May, beginning of June, and then your second flush will usually go more into August. So you can prune a little bit in August, but now is really the right time to do most of your pruning on your evergreens. We're going to talk about when we're pruning these shrubs, we're just going to be looking at 2 types of tools, and we always call these, I know we call them pruners, but anything you cut plant with is pruner. These are secateurs, and they're called bypass. And we're also going to be using the shears, which are the longer bladed pruners. But the shape you want the plant to grow to be depends what tool you use. Most of us, if we've had the big old spreading junipers in our garden, but what we've done over time is we kept using the shears or electric shears, God forbid, on our junipers, and they've all become the same shape. Usually when you buy a juniper, you bought it, just put one up here, you bought it because you like that spreading form, you like the laciness of it. This is one called gold lace juniper. And what we've done what we do when we're trying to control the size is we're always taking our shears out and just randomly shearing the plants. By doing that, wherever you cut the stem, usually it produces more than one stem, so you're just making the plant fuller and fuller, but you're losing this nice form that you have with it. And so with evergreens, it's a lot different than with deciduous plants. With deciduous shrubs, you can prune back quite hard, and the plant will usually rejuvenate from that. But because evergreens are losing that oldest growth every year, if you prune a stem back into where there's bare, where there's no growth in towards the center of the plants, that's not going to rejuvenate for you. So you have to remain out in the newer growth. At least 1 or 2 years of growth has to remain on that stem in order to keep growing well. Just on the way here, drove past some evergreens, and you can tell they've been sheared, and the sides are all bare and woody, and they're going to remain that way. So proper pruning on the evergreens is really important because it will extend the length of time. If you're not pruning properly, something like a spreading juniper may last 15, 20 years in your garden. But if you're pruning it properly every year, then it will last much longer in the garden. So it can really prolong the length of your plant material. And so we're talking about the different tools. So if all we're doing is shearing this shrub all the time, it's just going to become a full round globe. It's just going to look like another blob in your garden. And you probably already got a couple blobs in the garden. So we don't want blobs, we want to keep the characteristic of the plants. And so one way, the shears, is if you want to make a plant more formal. If we're doing a hedge of some sort of that, a boxwood hedge, you would want to use the shears because you want it nice and full and dense, and you want to maintain a certain shape of plant. So that definitely is one of the goals for pruning. The other one is just maintaining the size. And quite often in our gardens, we wait till the evergreen's too big, whether it's a pyramid cedar that's already pushing up your east trough and causing damage. But we always wait till they're too big, and then we think, oh, we just need to hack it back. And hacking is never a proper horticultural term. With evergreens, you have to be very careful. But it's better to give them a light pruning every year than to wait till they're too big, because by then you're too late and you won't be happy with your results. So if you like a natural form of plant, and you like it looking lacy and just nice and frilly and that, again, the shears is just going to make this a very dense blob. But what you can do to help maintain the growth of it and slow it down is you can just prune individual branches. So if you're using your secateurs for that, you can still keep a natural form. And again, we need to stay out, and usually you can tell the newest growth, the growth that's already pushed out this year, the stems are quite yellowy green. As soon as I get back into this section here, the stems are a bit more tanny cinnamon color. And as I keep going back, the stems get thicker and usually less color to them, more of a tan or gray in color. So we can't cut things way back into where it's bare, but we want to stay out in that tip growth. So you're just going to make cuts just before another branch comes out the side of that. And say if this branch is really doing something odd, we could take it back to there. So we're taking off 6 inches of growth off some of the stems. And so we're still maintaining the size of it. We're slowing down the growth rate. You can't keep an evergreen at one size forever, or soon that inner growth that's browning out every year is now the outside growth. So you just have to slowly go at it. But again, if you're just doing this once a year, just go through, choose some of your longest stems, and just nip back. We still kept a very nice natural form to it. It still has that kind of arms stretching out, that kind of lacy, sprawly kind of effect to it. So if you do like a natural form, definitely just be taking individual cuts. It takes a little bit more time, but you'll be a lot happier results. So if we had a branch that was coming up and doing a real odd thing that we didn't like where it was going, you can go back and cut that branch right out. But before you do that, just make sure you always kind of move that branch out of the way, and are you leaving a hole in the center? This branch is kind of covering up that area in the center that's starting to go bare just because of age. So if I move that branch right out, then it's going to leave the center open, which will show more browning. So I'm not going to be pruning that one at all. And but yeah, just go through and pick individual branches, and you'll keep that nice natural form a lot longer. I always think of a garden so boring where it becomes all just big green globes or flat globes, or you can see all the bare stems at the bottom, and you just have kind of a cloud of growth at the top. So if you like the shape of the shrub, you like it more natural looking, put your shears down and just take your pruners and start just pruning some of the longest branches in first. And that way you're slowing down the growth every year. Instead of it growing 6 inches, 8 inches a year, you keep it growing down to 2 inches. So usually as a rule of thumb, I always think take about 2/3 to 3/4 of that newest growth off, and that will just slow it down. So it will take 12 years for it to grow as big as what, if you didn't prune it, it might only take 5 or 6 years to grow that size. So you can just maintain the shape, but we still kept a very natural form to it. But again, I've taken about 6 inches off some of the branches. So it's just going to stay in its space in the garden much longer than that. This is a false cypress here. Again, it's kind of a nice lacy, frilly type of look to it. And I'm not wanting to look that way. I'm not wanting to lose that look. If I took the shears to it, it's just going to become a very dense globe. And but you can see some branches are getting a lot taller than others. So just to control that growth, again, I'm just going in with my secateurs and making some individual cuts. As you follow the stems back, you'll see the point where it's just bare wood, that there's no growth towards the center. And it's not reason to panic or think that the shrub is not doing well. That's just its natural habit to lose its old growth. But even by taking off some of the longer stems in that, we've still kept the naturalness of the shrub, but we're also slowing down its rate of growth, which is usually the goal in the garden. If you waited till this outgrew its spot, then you whack it back at that point, you're going to leave a lot of dead areas into the shrub, and you'll just never be happy with how it looks. So when you're pruning, the secateurs is always best if you're wanting to keep that natural form. If we have something like the boxwood here, and boxwood is one in the garden that we usually like to keep sheared and shaped and keep it to a certain size, and that if you like the looseness of a boxwood, and this would be the same with euonymus, you could still take your secateurs and just make individual cuts and just control the overall size. So we're slowing down the growth, we're taking off some height onto it, but it's still going to have its naturalness in it. So you really have to decide, do you want everything sheared and shaped? With nothing wrong with that, if you like a more formal garden or have a lot of topiaries in your garden, or whether you do like that natural form. So if you're wanting it more shaped form, that's when you would pull out the shears. And the shears, a lot of people use them this way on, and we'll show on a hedge here later. If you're holding them this way, it's hard to give a nice shape to it. You're always having to really turn your arms to get that. But think about holding them what we consider upside down. And that way it always is hugging the shrub, it's much easier. So then we would just stay out in that new growth, and we would just start to shape the plants. So if you want that dense, very formal look to some shrubs, boxwoods are great because they shear very well. The yews also shear very nicely. As I said, all evergreens loses their oldest growth every year, and then once you get back into that dead wood, it doesn't rejuvenate. The yews are a plant that, the only one that does rejuvenate from old growth. So even if you cut back to dead wood in a yew, it will reproduce new growth off that old wood. But all your other evergreens, you really do have to stay out where that new growth is. And so the shears will just give you that nice dense appearance. So decide whether you want a natural look to your shrubs, or whether you're trying to form a hedge, or you just like a nice dome shape in the garden, or maybe you have like a boxwood spiral or cedar pom-pom, and that's when you would be using your shears. Otherwise, kind of be using more the secateurs. Takes a bit longer, but you'll be much happier with the end result. So here in our back garden at the garden center, we have this mugo pine, and it's probably been in here 15-20 years. And usually by that time, a lot of evergreens are really just starting to outgrow their space. This one gets candled most years. And what I wanted to show on this one is the pines are different. They call it new growth. They first come out just kind of like a birthday candle on a cake, and tan color, and that's what they call the candle of the pine. And we talked about how you can't remove a lot of the older wood, you have to stay out in that new growth. But what we can do, here we're going to get about 6 inches of new growth coming out on the pine. But if you really need to reduce that, again, do that every year. Don't wait till it gets too big and then try to go at it. But what we can do is remove 2/3 to 3/4 of that candle. So you can either go in with your secateurs, So the candle actually ends here, but I'm going to just prune about 2/3 of that off. So instead of it growing 6-8 inches a year, again we can limit it to only about 2 inches a year. So that just means that that pine will fit in that space so many more years than what you normally have. If it's a larger shrub in that, you can use your shears and just kind of generally go through and prune again about 2/3, 3/4 of that candle off. Again, if we go back into the older growth, into the older wood, you can tell as we get to the middle it gets bare. You can prune back into like the next year's growth. So usually you can tell that below the candle there'll be just a straight stem, and then lower down it'll start to branch out from there. And so that's your last year's growth. So you could prune back into that growth as well. But if you go too far in too often, again it's just going to leave a bare look. So you can just take your shears and kind of finish it off. But again, if you wait till the shrub is too big, it's going to be very difficult to make that shrub look nice. So make sure you're going at your evergreens every year and just slowing the rate down. And that will keep them nice and compact and not get too wild on you. So here we have a boxwood hedge, and as you can see it's just pushed out all this newer lighter green growth, and the growth is just starting to fade. And to get that nice formal look to it, it definitely needs a haircut like I do. So what we do, because we wanted a dense, tight form, is we're going to use the shears again. And this really demonstrates, I was just talking about, if you hold the shears this way, the blades are always pointing upwards. So you'd have to be always pruning like this to prune level. But if you turn the shears this way on, the blades actually point straight across. If you wanted to, you could string a line where you want to cut the hedge down to, and just put a couple stakes in, or have kind of a stick that you can put beside it so you know you're staying level with that. But I find if you have the shears this way, usually you stay pretty accurate for that. Again, even though the boxwood has leaves, it's still evergreen, so we can't go back too far with it into the old wood, but we can definitely be cleaning it up. You don't want to be doing a lot of shearing of evergreens on a really hot day if it's 30 degrees or so. Sometimes the foliage underneath it, just because it hasn't been seeing as strong as sunlight, can actually burn a little bit. Some people use electric shears for doing this kind of job, but you have to remember with electric shears, it's just two blades running really fast together. You're not getting a clean cut. It's more or less just ripping the foliage off, which just sounds cruel. And with not getting a sharp cut onto when you're pruning, you're going to get more dieback on the cuts. You'll get more browning in the leaves and that. So you want to make sure that you've gone through and make sure your shears are nice and sharp and clean. So we're just going to go along, and again we're just going to stay in that newer growth on top, just to where you can start seeing the darker green growth below. And that way we can really start to control how much it's going to grow a year. We can keep that nice form to it. When you're doing a hedge, it's also very important that the base of the hedge is always a little bit wider. The hedge should actually taper out. If the hedge goes straight down, or sometimes we get the hedge, the top will be wider than the bottom is, and then the sunlight isn't hitting evenly below, and so you'll get it kind of thinning out at the base. But when you're shearing down the hedge, just make sure that you're, again, making sure that the bottom is slightly wider than the top is, and it will stay nice and full down to the bottom for you. So you just want to make sure you square it off nicely, give the sides a nice trim as well. And again, the boxwoods will probably send out another flush of growth more into mid-August, late August, so probably need a bit of a shearing at that time as well. But just make sure you're staying level. You're not getting back into the old wood too badly. It's still nice and green on top, and that will just shape it up and keep it nice and dense for you and give you that formal look that you're after. So today we picked a nice little shady garden to work in, and I've got a dense yew in front of me, and the dense yew just has a nice natural spreading form to it. It's already pushed out its new growth for the year, just in the last couple of weeks, and that growth is just starting to fade. We talked about how the new growth usually comes out a nice light green, and it's just starting to harden up and fade into a darker green in color. So now is a great time to be pruning it. We talked about if you're pruning things with your shears, if we did that with this yew, it would just lose its natural form. It would just become a flat box or a globe or whatever you wanted to make it into. And if that's your goal, that's fine to do. With it being more of a woodsy type of garden that we're in, we want to keep that natural form going. So today I'll just be using my secateurs and making individual cuts. So if there's a branch that's coming up higher than what you want, you can just go in and individually cut those branches. Or if the branch is spreading out further than what you want as well, you just cut the branches that you want to kind of thin out or control. And the great thing about the yews is, we talked about evergreens lose their oldest growth every year, but the yews actually, if you do cut back into bare wood, they will rejuvenate off that. It might take it a whole season to do that, but we can just go and chop individual branches. And by doing so, we're still controlling the size of the plant, but it's going to maintain that nice natural form that we want to have with it. If you want it to be a big box, you can make it that way, but in the situation that it's in, it wouldn't really fit the garden. Sometimes they're just starting to encroach on different shrubs in that too, so you just have to be nipping in and pruning back some branches. But we're just taking off about 6 inches or so. And once again, you don't want to wait till the shrub is way too big and then start pruning it back. But if you're doing this on a yearly basis, once a year, you can kind of control that growth, and it's not going to get out of hand onto you near the same. And it will also last in your landscape. Instead of maybe 10, 15 years, maybe you'll get 20, 25, 30 years out of the same plant just by proper pruning. So just kind of look through and see. Sometimes the branches are starting to get heavy. We have a branch up here that's really extending through. So I'm just cutting above another side branch. And sometimes if you're finding that the evergreen is just kind of weighing down, just by shortening up some of the branches, you can just kind of get that to perk up. Up here, if we have a branch that's coming up higher than what we want, we can follow it back down to a side branch. And then we've controlled the height. We've taken a good 10 inches off the height of the plants, and it's still nice and full. You can't see where you've made your cuts, so it doesn't look like it's been sheared to death. And you'll keep that nice natural form into your evergreens. If you haven't fertilized your evergreens yet this year, usually you can start the end of April, beginning of May, but even into early June now that we are. If you haven't fertilized, you can be using a nice organic fertilizer on it. We carry Actisol as a product name, and it's organic. It's mixed with hen manure, and it's in a pellet form. So when you sprinkle it around the base of the shrubs and that you're doing, it just slowly dissolves as you're watering or it's raining, and it's just a nice slow feed to your evergreens. So even up into the beginning of June, if you haven't done it yet, you could be using the Actisol. We have a tree and shrub, just kind of an all-purpose fertilizer for that. And also be careful on the watering. If it's a newly planted evergreen that you're dealing with, make sure that even when you dig the hole, if the soil at the bottom of the hole is really dry, it doesn't hurt to pour in half a bucket of water into the hole, let that drain through and settle in, and then that moisture is right at the root system ready to go. And when you're watering newly planted shrubs, make sure you're not watering far out and all the water is rolling away from the plant, but try and get watering right at the base of the plant itself, and just give it a good soaking. It really depends. If it's in shade, you won't have to water as often. If you're in full sun, you might have to water more often. But the one thing that's for sure is, it's better to water once or twice a week, very heavy, than to water a little bit every day. We're always tempted before we go off to work or that to just put the hose on it quickly for a minute or two and think, oh, it's good to go. And a shrub or anything with a deeper root system really prefers a long, deep soaking. So if you can let the hose run slowly, or maybe if it's a new garden you're putting in, set up a soaker hose that you can turn on for an hour or so, and just let that water soak into the ground. It's so important. We would know that it takes only an inch of water to keep your lawn green. But if you think of any new evergreens, shrubs, trees that you're planting, as well as any established ones, that same inch of water isn't going to do anything for those shrubs. So even if you have an irrigation system, you still need to be very careful on your watering, and it might need more. Just because your lawn's nice and green doesn't mean your shrubs are happy. So do that long, deep soaking. Let the hose run very slowly at the base of the plant for a longer period. Set up that soaker hose, but make sure that soil, and even when you're done watering, kind of dig into the soil and see how far down that moisture went. And I think you'll be surprised that it hasn't gone that deep into the soil. On the other hand, you want to be careful that you're not overwatering. If you have a heavier clay soil, sometimes the water can sit on top of that clay layer. So just be careful with the watering. If it's, again, newly planted, your evergreens or that, even dig a hole down beside the root ball and see how far that moisture is going down. It's hard to tell with the evergreen because it doesn't wilt like the deciduous shrubs. So you never know, is it has enough water or too much water. But the best way is even just digging down beside it and saying, okay, I watered for an hour, it's only moist 3 inches down. Then you know you need to give it a bit more water. So now's the time of year as we're getting warming up. We started having a couple 30-degree days around here in Niagara. And so really watch your watering. But just remember that a big tree, a big evergreen, definitely needs more water than your lawn does. So if you have that irrigation system, that's great for the lawn, maybe for your flowers, perennials, but still keep an eye out on your evergreens and trees. If you are using a chemical-based fertilizer, maybe you're using something like Miracle-Gro or that, just be careful you're not getting into too high in nitrogens when you're fertilizing, if you fertilize during the summer months on the shrubs, especially if the soil is dry. It's always best to water your plants before you start to fertilize, because if it's a liquid fertilizer, the plants take it up very quickly. But if the soil is dry and your plant's taking up that fertilizer very quickly, and with the synthetic chemical-based fertilizers, it's going to take up that much more quick, and it can cause some burning on dry plants. Organic is always safer. The organic fertilizers will never burn a shrub, so always go organic when you can. But if you are using those synthetic fertilizers, always water first. Your shrubs, you really don't want to be fertilizing much into September, October. Even by mid-August, stop fertilizing them. You can still be fertilizing your vegetables and your annuals and that. But you don't want to be forcing out new growth on the shrubs too late into the season, where the growth doesn't have a chance to harden up before the cold temperatures come in. So if you fertilize, if you're using organic, that usually lasts for at least 6 weeks. So kind of just mark on the calendar when you fertilize next. But usually for most of your evergreens, even your flowering shrubs and that, if you fertilize 2-3 times a season, they'll be quite happy with that. So before you start doing any pruning in your garden, you have to make sure that your pruners are nice and clean and sharp. And we've done in our, if you look to our pruning deciduous shrubs video, you'll see all the cleaning tips and that, how to keep your blades nice, especially when you're pruning evergreens. They get kind of sticky, especially with the pines and junipers. So make sure you're just cleaning those off. Watch the video to get all the tips about that, and make sure that they're clean. If you're going from one shrub that might have had a disease or insect problem onto another plant, also you could be transferring that disease or that insect problem to your new plant. So even if you're pruning something, you think, oh, you've got a bit of insect problem, even just have a bucket with half bleach, half water, and dip your pruners into it as you're pruning, and that will keep them sterilized and keep them from spreading problems in your garden. But go to our pruning deciduous shrubs, and that will give you all the tips for keeping your pruners clean and sharp.